This third lesson of Module 3 will be taken by Professor Laura Sue Armeni, that you already know, but just few words. Professor Armeni has a strong and solid experience in risk management, public policy, and sustainable mobility. She is currently serving as Director of the Risk Management Policy and the European Affairs Department at the Authority for Transport in Malta. And today her lecture will be on understanding the market demand and investigating the competitive advantage of enterprises through sustainability, considering the role of green certifications. That is the focus of this module 3 of the course. The lesson will last 3 hours, and it will be recorded for your future needs. So thank you to Professor Armeni for being here, and she can share her presentation and start the lesson. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that introduction. Right, from beginning, yes. You should be able to see my presentation now,
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, we can see.
All right. Little bit of housekeeping as we go along. I know I said this last time, but please feel free to stop me, interrupt me. From time to time, I will come back to check in and see also if you have any questions. But if you have any comments, I would love to hear them as we go along. So please just jump in. If you raise your hand, I won't always be able to see it because I only get rotating 4 people on my screen when the presentation is in presenting mode. All right, so our topic today is market demand and competitive advantage through sustainability and the impact of certification. Now, one thing which we have definitely realized is that environmental sustainability has, or maybe originally started as being part of corporate responsibility, but it has now become a way, as a defining feature more than anything, of the competitive edge of organizations. Essentially, over the past decade, we have seen so much policy in relation to climate science. We have seen so much commitment from different governments. We have also seen a good number of organizations ready to invest in technological change. And this has really given an elevation, if you will, to the concept of sustainability into a more financial, let's call it that, financial element of how companies are calculated, how companies are seen by the customers, by the investors, by the regulators, and what they think of that. So we have seen a really big transition. Now, from a market perspective, environmental sustainability seems to operate now as a lens almost through which stakeholders will assess organizational quality and preparedness. Now, this means that they will base their assumptions of the potential of the organization depending on how much sustainable advancements the organization has made. Now, this is a big shift because up until recently, companies were judged solely on the financial projections, right? So what is your financial performance like? Are you able to operate within the environment you want to operate? These are the different types of... Yeah. Okay. These are the different types of estimations that were made. Is it okay? Let me just mute. Okay.
Yes, I'm going to unmute all of them.
All right. No worries. So what I hope to be going through in this session mainly is more about how sustainability can really help us as a market mechanism more than as a reporting or a compliance topic. So once we need to be sustainable, we might as well do it in a way which can shape our performance, shape our cost structures, our risk exposure, and also, most importantly, our strategic position within the market. So the focus here is going to be more on the economic logic underpinning sustainability, more than sustainability and certification as we had in our first session. Now, when we look at all this, the role of certification comes into play because they are now seen as part of the infrastructure in a way that will enable markets to function when environmental performance becomes difficult to observe directly. So, how do you prove that you are sustainable as a company? But I've got my certificate. And that certificate is something which can also give you a legitimacy within the market. So, we are going to be looking at it from this perspective. Let me. Okay. Right, so with this in mind, this presentation will look at how sustainability influences customer behavior, investor decision, competitive positioning. We will also be explaining how certifications can act as the credible market signals and how you can use those. And we will also be looking at the strategic and economic implications of certification. The technical we already covered. All right. So let's start by looking at the strategic shifts. Now, what we know is that many industries are currently experiencing what one would describe as a strategic inflection, right? When it comes to environmental sustainability. Historically, we had sustainable initiatives which were done as incremental improvement. I changed the light bulbs, and I do this, and I do this. But they did not really affect the core strategy of the organization. They were almost cosmetic, almost done as a part of an obligation, right? Today, however, that has changed, and we are seeing sustainability implemented in procurement procedures, in the regulatory frameworks, in investment decisions made by organizations, because sustainability has essentially become what we call a structural determinant of competitiveness. Now, one of the things which is a very clear indicator of this is that environmental metrics are actually part of financial analysis nowadays, and investors are increasingly evaluating companies based on their exposure, for example, to transition risks, like carbon pricing, changing customer preferences, which we have seen quite a fluctuation, not as much as possibly from a policy perspective we would have liked, but we've seen quite a fluctuation already, and also technological disruption. So this combined with the fact that we have ample evidence which shows that sustainability has been profitable and has shielded some companies from some of the market fluctuations, we are now seeing a very difference in the type of valuations that are done and also in capital flow assessments. We're seeing a difference from what was done 10 to 15 years ago. Both in the private and in the public sector, we are seeing procurement changes, for example, where environmental criteria are becoming a necessity, a requirement, right? And companies are being asked, especially for the larger government tenders, for example, all across Europe, being asked to prove that they are sustainable, that they are providing sustainable products and services. But at the same time, these companies must remain competitive. So then the question becomes, how do we shift? How do we repackage what we offer to include a sustainable element without adding our A costs being necessary pricing? So this has led to our second point, which is a widening gap between what we call the leaders in the field and the laggards in the field. And those organizations that invested early in environmental capacities, like emission reduction technologies and low carbon technologies, are now reaping the benefits and are much better positioned than those companies that did not take the lead, right? So over time, remember what we spoke about in previous session, the one thing about sustainability is that it costs more to implement in the beginning, but over time that return on investment increases. Now, of course, those which were leaders in adapting are now having a higher return than those which were not, also because they've established a name in the market. In marketing, this is what one call the first mover advantage, but it has been inflated when it comes to sustainability. And yes, I think recognizing that there is this inflection point will help us to understand why environmental strategy is really moving from the periphery to the center almost of every corporate decision. And we don't just think of sustainability now. We think of sustainability combined with long-term value creation. So this is the change also in how we set the strategic objectives of our organization. Let's think about some relevance to core value drivers for organizations. So first of all, I think we would agree that one of the major core value driver is the revenue growth, right? And this is very much going to be affected through the sustainability sensitive customer segments. So companies that align their offers with the shifts in customer preferences can really access new markets essentially, and more importantly, strengthen customer loyalty, which is something that an organization should always strive to do. Now, what we do know is that financial margins will be affected whether we like it or not. If there is operational efficiencies, if there are resource productivity improvements, and investment in energy efficiency, process optimization, and waste reduction will initially cost, but they will, and there has been ample proof that they will eventually also deliver good cost savings, right? And so where we have industries which are very high energy or very material, have material intensity, these improvements will have a more meaningful effect over time on profitability, and also where resource prices are more volatile, this effect, the counter effect of sustainability, is going to help stabilize that throughout. Moving on to point 3, when we have risk management in climate related, we're looking mostly at physical risks, right here, extreme weather events, inability, mostly extreme weather events, but we've had a couple of tsunamis and so on, which were also caused by the weather. Now, what we have seen, and the whole world has seen, is that when these things happen, they really affect not just the place where they happen, but they also affect the supply chain worldwide. And this risk has been somewhat regulated with new policy, with technological advancements, but the reality is that there's still so much opportunity there for risk mitigation, and organizations which proactively are addressing these risks and therefore reducing volatile and having more planning certainty are seeing that this is very highly valued also by investors and by lenders to the organization. So when we look at, okay, what is the cost of capital, right? We have to consider that we have, sorry, let me go back. When we consider what is the cost from capital that needs to be done, we have to outweigh that with the cost of environmental performance and the ROI on that. And also, companies that are ready for low carbon transitioning are getting favorable financing conditioning from banks, from governments. And also, we have to understand that environmental sustainability contributes also to the intangible asset value. What's that? I'm referring here to the brand equity, to the trust that people have in the brand, to how credible the company is with stakeholders, and to the perceived view of the company when it comes to being a pioneer in its field. So this is obviously another ROI that one needs to take into account, and certification is kind of the rubber stamp on that, something that the company can show for it. Now let's have a bit of an example of how this really works in practice, because a lot of what we said until now has been very, very high level. So what you have in this slide is a bit of an example of how green innovation can progress through sequences of mutually reinforcing steps to lead to things like emission reduction. And what we've seen in practice is that in many instances, there has been some form of collaboration between the public and private sector. So rather than viewing innovation as a single breakthrough, in this case, we are seeing it as a system where technological development, where policy support, where market adoption is really continuously interacting, right? So what I wanted to really bring this out is that this is a market which has developed out of a need, right, coming out from originally from policy, and then it has really transitioned into R&D, into academic research, into public funding. So what we're seeing is that in many stages we are now focusing on how do we shift organizations, but not for how do we shift for today, but more so, how do we shift for the future? Let's say the concept of carbon. We are now seeing a very big hype on electric vehicles, but many organizations are not necessarily focusing on electric vehicles. Why? Because a lot of experiments are going on right now from a policy perspective, but also with some of the major organizations on hydrogen and nuclear vehicles, because most likely they could be the future following electric. So these are the companies that are really driving it all forward. I think we will see more of this in many other industries in the years to come. Right. So what drives this, however? Well, regulatory frameworks definitely drive this trajectory. They've driven it from the very beginning, right? And these policies not only are creating compliance obligations, but they're also shaping markets. They're shaping markets through their incentives. They're looking at lower impact business models. So we've seen a lot of shift in that. Institutional investors, including pension funds, asset management, they are increasingly integrating environmental consideration into the portfolios, like construction, for example. And this shift partly because of risk management, but it also reflects a growing recognition that environmental factors really will influence long-term returns. So as capital is flowing towards organizations, competitive dynamics are shifting simultaneously. And this is where the customer perception has become more and more important. Of course, with greater access to information, with a lot of let's face it, greenwashing that has gone out there. We have a customer base now that's more on the alert. They have the information, they have increased demands for transparency and accountability. And in many sectors, the customer is now expecting the company to demonstrate some form or other of credible action and resource use. So this is influencing things like their purchasing decisions, particularly in markets where environmental attributes align with the product value that they are buying. Now, other things which affect this is going to be the supply chain dynamics. Large organizations are more often than not setting emission targets that extend across their value chains. So effectively, they are transmitting to their supplier base that change needs to be done. We are seeing this in, being weaved into the industry, the fabric of industry, essentially in the way things are done, in the way operations are happening. And to a certain extent, it has become almost obligatory to form part of it rather than optional. A few years ago, you had the option not to be or appear to be sustainable. Another thing that has really made this possible is the technological advancements that have been made. We have more ability to make things visible. We have more ability to measure things now. There is ample opportunity for transparency, which obviously in turn reduces information asymmetry. Stakeholders can compare companies very easily and much more effectively. So, accelerating the process of integrating sustainability in decision making has become more important now than ever before. I'm just going to stop sharing just for 2 seconds, just to see if there are any questions, please. No? No questions?
No, I think no for the moment.
No. All right. Okay. So I'm going to share again and we'll go on. All right. So we next speak of sustainability as coming as a market signal, right? So we have markets which are characterized by uncertainty. We have markets which have incomplete information. And these signal a very crucial role in shaping the perceptions of people and the decisions of people. Now, environmental sustainability will give us a lot of information, therefore, about an organization's risk management capacities, about its operational discipline, and about its strategic orientation. And stakeholders, including the customer base, is relying on this information to interpret how well the company is positioned for future challenges. Now, stakeholders want to align themselves to a successful company. So when you have a strong environmental performance, which is nowadays very much equated to the fact that the company is proactive, it may very well not be, but this is the link, this is the connection that we're seeing being made. That is well managed, that is capable of navigating regulatory territory. This perception is influencing confidence, it's influencing trust, and it's influencing opportunities. Whereas weak signals, on the other hand, are creating some questions on governance quality and long-term resilience, which in the long term can even affect funding opportunities. So the credibility here of sustainability is going to depend heavily on the consistency between commitment, action, and outcome. Now, I always say It is possible, it takes so long to build a reputation, but it can take a few minutes to destroy that reputation. Stakeholders are increasingly scrutinizing whether companies are delivering measurable progress against their stated goals, and discrepancies between what is said and what is done will very quickly undermine that trust, essentially. So as a result, we always advise in such instances that a company, first of all, does not promise more than what it can deliver. And tying back to the discussion we had last week, also, yes, it's possible to obtain certain certificates in X amount of time. You also want to ingrain this within the culture of the organization, because you want to be able to maintain that certificate. You want to be able to maintain the implication of what showcasing that certificate imply on your company. This is also a reputation risk mitigation, right? All right, let's move on a bit to environmental signaling, because I think that interacts a lot with competitive dynamics. And obviously, leading firms would have ambitious targets very often in this regard. And with those ambitious targets, they also need to ensure that it's not just the internal stakeholders which are shifted, right? But also the external stakeholders, because our product, our service begins from core to until the moment the customer makes use of it. So what we create here is what we call a competitive escalation, where sustainable performance becomes a dimension almost along which companies start to compete for legitimacy and leadership. So obviously understanding this now explains why why sustainability can influence markets, but also goes beyond that. It has direct operational impact. And if one is perceived to be prepared, or one is perceived to be responsible, that's going to shape your stakeholder behavior. And in turn, that is going to affect the demand from your business, the capital allocation, and the strategic opportunities. All right. So let's speak a bit about initiative and capability. Now, there's a distinction between treating sustainability as a set of initiatives. We do this, we change that, but also then embedding it within the organization capability, which is really central to what the organization has to offer to its customer base. So isolated initiatives can be energy projects, they can be short-term campaigns, and they will deliver improvements, but there's going to be improvements which is delayed ROI. These types of changes are not going to transform the competitive advantage of the organization. Capabilities, on the other hand, involve integrating sustainability into the decision-making process, into the government structures and the organization culture. Now, that will eventually change how we look at sustainability and also competitive advantage. So capability development begins often with measurement and data infrastructure. Organizations, for obvious reasons, need to be able to track emissions, resource use, environmental impacts, and they use this information to set targets and to monitor their progress and to be able to report on those, because there's a lot of funding opportunities that they could tap into if they do that. Now, these data capabilities not only support internal decision making, but they also enable very credible external communication. And we have seen that this is very much important for maintaining stakeholder trust, so one can never underestimate it. Environmental considerations would also influence to some extent the product design and operational processes. So obviously, it has to be embedded into how businesses operate rather than looking at it as a general function. Now, cross-function integration will typically enable organizations to identify synergies between environment and financial objectives more easily, right? None of this would be possible, though, if there are no good leaders within the organization, because leadership and governance is going to play a very critical role to how these capabilities are developed over time. You need to have clear accountability, you need to have aligned incentives, very consistent messages coming from senior management. So the constant reinforcement to establish a culture which is environmentally conscious needs to be there. And without this alignment, we risk losing the momentum and remaining at the peripheral, which is what happened to some organizations. So, at the end of the day, if we treat sustainability as a capability, then we are at a better advantage to convert it into competitive advantage, right? All right. Now, we've spoken a lot about the consumer and what the consumer wants. Let us move a bit away from that and focus more on the demand, the institutional demand. So in most industries, demand is not shaped by a single source. Demand is shaped by a network more than anything of stakeholders, and these more or less collectively would need to influence expectations or purchasing behaviors. So they include institutional buyers, investors, regulators, employees, supply chain partners. I mean, all of these would come into play, right? And institutional demand would most likely come from the more larger side of things, okay, and from the public sector. So to this extent, we have seen large buyers, for example, account for a significant market share, and their requirements have effectively defined baseline expectations for entire sectors, right? Investors also play very demand shaping roles, and they direct capital towards organizations, towards companies that demonstrate credible environmental strategies. Now, the demand for sustainability performance here influences by default the corporate priorities because access to capital remains a fundamental requirement of organizations. So the way sustainability is used is typically integrated into investment mandates, and indirectly, therefore, they are shaping products, operations, and the marketing position of the organization. Hopefully, we are looking at a situation where demand becomes phenomenal in a way that responds to all of the market sustainability demand, because this is obviously what's going to give the baseline for companies to do this more holistically and in a way that really takes us all to the next level when it comes to sustainability. All right. Now, we had a bit of a discussion in previous session, and we will come back to it now, on whether the consumer is willing to spend more to be sustainable. And I think, 1 second. One second. There's somebody who's asking to be let in. Okay, you're in. Okay, Maggie. No worries. All right, so back to consumer behavior and willingness to pay. So what we've seen is that consumer behavior, when it comes to real scenarios, is really influenced by a combination, let's call it that, of perceived value, of trust, and convenience, right? So just think about it. Forget sustainability. How many of you needed that one or two products urgently and went to a convenience store and were willing to pay more to get what you needed at the moment, right? So sustainability attributes are very influential, or especially when they reinforce, when they're combined with the product that we want and core values like durability, quality, and performance, depending on what the item is. So what we've seen is that when sustainability is combined with these, it's actually seen as more viable and worth it. And there's a bigger demand for it than when it's seen as a standalone option. So we've got a lot of research which shows a gap between consumer intentions and actual purchasing behavior. And whilst many consumers express concern about environmental issues, many shifts are being made in how people see things. We've got entire generations which are more environmentally alert, more sensitive to the environment than other generations, but we have to face reality. And the reality is that purchasing decisions are still very much influenced by price, by convenience, and by brand familiarity. So sustainability is effective commercially, but when the product also hits these important values. Trust is also playing a very critical role. Consumers are becoming more and more aware of greenwashing, for example, and therefore they are placing more influence on credible information like certification, on transparent reporting, but most importantly on consistent messaging. And that becomes essential because you cannot, what you portray as an organization, you need to live as an organization. And it's not always easy, let's put it this way, when you've got very large organizations. But what we know is that brands that successfully build trust around their environment performance do tend to achieve stronger loyalty and reduce price sensitivity. Demographic factors will also influence these patterns, right? So as I was saying before, we've got a generation of younger consumers and higher income segments that are placing more emphasis on sustainability. And hopefully these segments will continue to grow and sustainability will be further normalized. Overall, consumer demand for environmental sustainability is best seen as a reinforcing factor, right? The idea is that it amplifies competitive differentiation when aligned with product value, but as things stand, it does not yet compensate. I say this cautiously because potentially not in all areas, but in most parts of the areas, it does not yet compensate for weaknesses in price, quality, or convenience. In fact, many governments, for a while, or in some instances still continue to, for example, offer grants for people to shift to electric vehicles, right? All right. In terms of procurement, business-to-business procurement is becoming a very big source of sustainability demand. We've seen large organizations increasingly embedding environmental criteria into supplier selection, contract renewal, and performance evaluation process. And this criteria may include, or in some cases did include, emission intensity, environmental management, resource efficiency, and competitive and compliance. Now, because procurement decisions are long-term decisions, right, and often involve significant volumes, they can really reshape how competition flows towards the more sustainable businesses. And obviously, suppliers that meet these environmental demands will gain access to good revenue streams. So there is almost a need for this investment. And when there is this all creates a strong kind of reason why companies should invest in environmental performance. Now, this then has a cascading nature because when large organizations set sustainability requirements, their expectations propagate through the tiers, right, of the supply chain. And firms within those tiers will also feel the need, the push to become more and more sustainable. Also, there is an element of standardization here which comes into play. Now, certification and data will allow customers to be able to compare, customers and suppliers, to be able to compare one company with another. And when they do this, obviously, the more sustainable type of organizations are going to have higher demand. Give me just 1 second because there is a message. So once this course is over, where can we stay informed about these markets and policy trends? Which sources would you recommend we consult? Well, it depends where you are operating. If you're operating in Europe, the European Union has taken the lead in driving this. So definitely policies and directives in relation to climate change coming out of the EU. I mean, most of the information here is extracted from there, from the latest. We have, so that's definitely one source you want to keep updated with. What you will find is that some directives, but they will all be published, so you can access this all online. Some directives, however, have agreed adjustments, let's call them that, for specific countries. So some countries would have entered into bilateral agreements and arrangements with the European Union. So the main taxes would stand, but there would be some exceptions, right, for certain countries. And these exceptions would typically depend on the size, on the nature of the business, and so on. So you would want to see where as well there would have been deviations in the area you're operating. But in principle, that's the first repository I would look at. Carla, does this answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, let me just share again. Right. So just a small thing, and we move on from this slide. I think procurement is going to become one of the main pushes for sustainability. So companies don't only need to be sustainable, but one good thing to do is to go and look at recent tenders, for example, that were issued, government tenders, because there is one directive which is specifically on having green procurement in every possible means or form. And you can already see the type of requirements that are being asked from organizations at this early stage. All right, let's speak a bit now about investor expectations and capital allocation. So capital markets have really emerged as a major force nowadays, and they are shaping demand for environmental sustainability more than ever. So investors, as we've already said, are viewing environmental factors as financially material. right? They influence long-term risks and they influence the return profiles. So obviously it's of given importance. We have climate transition risks to take care of, we have physical risks, we have regulatory changes. And all three can have a direct effect on cash flow, on asset value, and on growth perspective. So this is why I give it a lot of importance. So this makes, I would say, environmental performance an inevitable way to go. And institutional investors are therefore looking at investment analysis and portfolios, but more importantly, we're looking at more active engagement. We're looking at a situation where shareholders are using their voting rights and the dialogue to really influence corporate sustainable strategies. And more importantly, I would say, we've also seen debt markets, for example, incorporate sustainability into lending and underwriting practices, and this says a lot. So yes, I would say sustainability is being integrated into everything like credit assessments, lending conditions, insurance pricing, green bonds, sustainability-linked loans, climate assessments are becoming more common. And we have also seen them being used as a basis for financial incentives. So in a way, there's a very cumulative effect of trends, which is happening right now. And this is, as we go along, inevitably also requiring greater investment capacity, I would say. All right, let's have a bit of a look at this diagram. So what we have here is a bit of an understanding of how organizations can perceive ESG and also how they can move from risk management lens towards a more value creation lens. So the data you have there point collectively that most businesses no longer see ESG as a compliance exercise, but as something that can influence enterprise value, competitive positioning, and long-term growth. If we look at the very first statistic, it is roughly that 2/3 of businesses expect initiatives to increase the enterprise value effect. Now, this expectation is not grounded in there, it's grounded in many mechanisms, including gains in operational efficiency, in access to new markets, in improved brand equity, and I think more importantly, reduced risk exposure. So, it's just ESG is in a way being incorporated into the strategic planning, again, not a peripheral activity. The next figure tells us that about 1/3 of organizations expect no impact on their value. Now, this is very, very interesting, right, to interpret, because there's a lot of optimism, there's a lot of push to invest. But this figure tells us that organizations probably are doing this, not because they are seeing the value of the future, but it is the thing that must be done now to retain the business of today. So this is a very interesting from a policy, from a industry consulting perspective. This is very interesting, right? Because it gives us a lot of information on how companies and consumers are seeing things, and they are seeing things differently. There's also a lot of uncertainty that stems here, and this is mostly coming from challenges in measurement, challenges in time horizons, and also many sustainability benefits materialize over the medium to longer term, not the short term. So there's no nothing to showcase for it in many instances. Now, fewer than 5% of respondents believe ESG destroys value. Now, that's also very telling. Because while concerns about short-term investment costs is, let's say, it's a minority view now, right? They remain, however, the main drivers behind the broader perception that strategic risks of not investing in sustainability can outweigh the cost of action, right? So this is a very interesting figure because it creates a contradiction in itself. Do we have any questions, please? Right. Let's talk a bit about talent now. Workforce expectations will continue to represent an increasingly influential but often underappreciated driver of sustainability. Employees, especially those in highly skilled and knowledge-intensive roles, are more likely to evaluate employers based on purpose, on value alignment, and on environmental commitments. So what we have here is a shift that reflects broader societal awareness of environmental issues and the desire, more essentially, from employees for meaningful work which aligns with their own values. Now, from an organizational perspective, this is slightly different because talent demand influences competitiveness, and this typically through recruitment, through retention, and engagement. So companies with strong environmental credentials, therefore, may find it easier to attract skilled employees than those where competition for talent is especially in sectors where competition for talent is intense, than those which do not have the same impact for sustainability. Now, in essence, what you will see when you look at the company books, you will see this translated in gains, you will see this translated in innovation capacity, and you will see this translated in the turnover reporting of the organization. Employee engagement is also very important in this respect. And when employees perceive that the organization is responsible and forward-looking, they are often more motivated and more committed to stay on, which obviously can improve also their execution and performance and collaboration. So one could say that internal advocacy and investing in this can further advocate and reinforce external reputation. And thus, if you do manage this, you can create a real good circle of trust and credibility. In addition, you could use your employees as catalysts for organizational change. Internal initiatives, innovation projects, grassroots sustainability efforts, they often originate from engaged employees who identify opportunities. So bottom-up dynamics complement a lot top-down strategy in these instances. And one thing we have seen is that over time, team dynamics can shape industry and companies compete not only for customers in these cases, but also for skilled employees. So environmental sustainability will need to become part of the employee's value proposition, influencing their culture, their performance, and also their packages. All right, the next thing we will look at is geographic and regularity variable. So demand for environmental sustainability varies significantly across regions, and this mostly due to differences in regularity frameworks, differences in economic structures, and in cultural expectations. We have European markets that, for example, tend to exhibit much stronger regulatory drivers and high level of consumer awareness when compared to others. Now, obviously, this means that there's a more mature demand environment, and in contrast, in emerging markets, for example, we have uneven demand patterns. There are global supply chains which often transmit expectations across regions, meaning that companies operating internationally would need to navigate this complex landscape of different requirements, whilst maintaining essentially consistent standards, because that otherwise could have a direct effect on your brand reputation. Regulatory alignment is also extremely important. And regional frameworks will very often, converge and try to find common objectives for emission reduction, transparency, and so on. Now, we have seen a trend towards reduced fragmentation. In my humble opinion, we're still far off from achieving that, both from a policy and an industry perspective. But the positive side is that we have seen a trend going there. Now, coupled with this comes the geographical variability, which can create essentially both risks and opportunities. So companies that anticipate regulatory tightening, for example, in specific markets, can position themselves ahead of competition, while those that fail to adapt can face barriers. And this could be barriers to entry, but it could also be increased compliance costs, for example. So understanding the regional demand patterns becomes very critical for strategic planning and market positioning. And environmental sustainability needs, within this framework, needs to be embedded in the market expectations globally. All right. Now, obviously, getting a certificate is one thing. Maintaining that is a completely different story. Now, furthermore, the structure, the nature, the need for sustainability will differ across industries, right? And across locations as well. We have high impact sectors. These are transportation, energy, heavy manufacturing, and these typically have the most immediate pressure, right? All the initial directives, for example, related to climate change had a chapter about these three. So this will result, therefore, in earlier adoption of certain strategies. Then you have the consumer facing industries, which may experience vast reputation effects because their brand perception is playing a more central role in competition. So companies in sectors like retail, like food, like consumer goods, right, will respond to product innovation, packaging changes, supply chain transparency initiatives, and the whole idea here is more or less to create, to position the organization in a way that can directly influence the purchasing behavior. Capital-intensive industries may experience demand primarily through investors and regulators. Say, for example, you've got infrastructure and industrial sectors, which often have to face pressure from to decarbonize. And in these contexts, we must see sustainability demands as manifesting itself through the financial conditions, through the regulatory compliance, and through the market presence. So in the end, industry ecosystems can really influence how quickly sustainability becomes a competitive requirement. When we have leading firms that adopt ambitious targets, right? And when they are able to follow through, that following through creates legitimacy. That legitimacy can accelerate the way the market responds to them. So you need to understand how your specific industry correlates with sustainability and what is the dynamic when the two come together for competitive advantage. All right, let's talk a bit about pathways from environmental performance to advantage now. So we have established in previous slides that environmental sustainability can create competitive advantage. What we still need to establish is how. Now, we don't see these pathways as theoretical, right? They come from how environment is responding and interacting with costs, revenues, risks, and stakeholder perceptions more than anything else. So understanding the mechanisms becomes essential because it really clarifies why sustainability can generate tangible business value rather than remaining purely reputational one, which is what, for the most part, it was viewed as. Now, one major pathway is differentiation. So when environmental performance aligns with customer priorities or procurement requirements, it influences purchasing decisions and it strengthens the position. This differentiation is particularly powerful when sustainability attributes reinforces for product value, right? Another pathway is through cost structures. So environmental initiatives such as energy efficiency, for example, can lead to measurable operational savings. So in resource-intensive industries, you can easily see improvements in your margins and also in stabilizing the price volatility a lot. So here, I think the economic logic of this, from what we've said so far, I would say is pretty straightforward. Remember risk mitigation, it's also a third pathway, and the strategies need to be able to address climate change, regulatory change, and supply change, amongst other things, but those are the three basic ones. And by addressing those, organizations can also give stability in markets which otherwise not be stable, and therefore this also gives them some form of competitive edge. It's also very important to remember that these pathways they can reduce costs, they can lower. Yes? Sorry. They can reduce costs, they can lower lower emissions, but they will not do so visibly in the immediate, right? This is going to be something which takes time. Right, okay, let's look a bit now at revenue growth and market expansion. We'll have two more slides just to give you a bit of an idea. We'll have two more slides and then you can get a quick, I think then you can get a quick coffee if you want, okay? So when it comes to revenue growth, this is typically by accessing new markets, by strengthening your customer loyalty, and by supporting your premium positioning, essentially, right? So in many industries, the demand for lower impact products is expanding. So consumers are becoming more aware of the environmental issues. We have established before that consumers don't necessarily want to pay more for sustainable products, but the awareness is there. The consciousness has started to build. So companies can jump onto the bandwagon now. This is a perfect timing, actually, and capture these opportunities and then establish themselves as the person, the company to go to. Now, market access definitely remains the main revenue growth option. And we have seen certain contracts which require now evidence of environmental performance. We've also seen opportunities to meet these requirements, which can really open doors to opportunities that would have not been available without them. And I think when it comes to environmental innovation, we have seen quite a couple of completely new products, for example, come into play, like low carbon material, We have seen circular service business models, for example, come into play, energy efficiency technology. So these innovations are not only generating revenue, but they're also positioning the companies that employ them as the leaders in their respective fields. Another concept is premium pricing. So the idea here is that premiums tend to be the most sustainable, where environmental attributes enhance overall product value rather than being perceived as an added cost. So we have got sectors like consumer goods, automotive, technology, sustainability, linked features, which can really contribute to the brand differentiation, which we spoke about earlier. Now, over time, revenue growth effects are strongest when sustainability is going to be integrated in product development and business strategy. Companies that are going to do this will most likely, at least this is what initial research shows us, will most likely be resistant in a positive sense, able to resist future growth demands. All right, let's talk a bit about cost leadership. So operational efficiency is one of the most potentially direct and measurable ways in which environmental sustainability contributes to competitive advantage. That much we have established. But improvements in resource productivity, like energy efficiency, water management, waste reduction, will translate into immediate savings, right? So these savings then can be particularly significant in industries which are very high energy and material intense. Now, energy efficiency initiatives like upgrading equipment, optimizing processes, improving building performances, reducing operating expenses, and costs, in addition to giving us cost savings, they can also reduce our exposure to things like energy price volatility, which I think has become a very increasing relevant source in the context of the current market fluctuations that we are experiencing. Circular resource strategies like recycle, reuse, and material substitution is also becoming extremely important and has been directly linked to competitiveness. So by reducing essentially the dependence on virgin inputs and minimizing wastes, we're seeing companies lower procurement and disposal costs. So we are seeing, okay, it's not the ultimate, but we are seeing a shift towards cost savings. Now remember that long-term renewable energy procurement represents another avenue for cost stability, because when you have power purchase agreements, for example, they can provide very predictable energy prices over extended periods, and this will definitely be of a plus to many industries. Because it provides stability and opportunities for long-term investment. So overall, I would say that resource productivity improvements do help us look at how environmental and financial objectives can align closely. But only when executed effectively can these initiatives strengthen margins and simultaneously improve environmental performance. So this is the only condition where there can be a win-win scenario amongst the two. Any questions so far? No questions? All right. All right, let's talk a bit about risk reduction and resilience now. So environmental sustainability enhances organizational resilience by addressing both the physical and the transition costs associated with climate change. Physical risks include extreme weather events, resource scarcities, disruptions to supply chain, Transition risks are policy changes, technological shifts, and evolving market preferences. Proactive environmental strategies can really help companies anticipate and mitigate these risks. For example, by diversifying suppliers and investing in resilient infrastructure, you can reduce dependence on high carbon assets, which also supports operational continuity. So, regulatory risks, I think, would be another important consideration. Governments implements environmental standards. We've seen a lot of governments implement stricter standards now. And companies that are already aligned with these standards would obviously face lower compliance costs and fewer operational adjustments. So the forward positioning can really create a competitive edge by allowing organizations to adapt more quickly and efficiently than their peers. Now, from a financial perspective, risk reduction contributes to lower earnings, as in the volatility in earnings, right, would be lower, and improved what we call creditworthiness. Investors and lenders will favor companies with robust risk management practices. In fact, very often it's become a very essential part of a cost-benefit analysis. We, in my organization, we do a lot of risk assessments to be submitted as part of the CPAs, for example, especially when it comes to loans, for example, loan applications. And investors and lenders would favor these, and they typically favor companies who are less exposed to shocks, right? So yes, with this in mind, I think resilience can really be seen as a very core component of competitive advantage, and companies that integrate environmental considerations into risks can be better equipped to navigate the disruptions, therefore, and maintain performance over time. All right, I'm going to stop sharing at this stage because this, I also want this to become a two-way conversation. So what we will do is this. If you agree, we will have a short break now. We'll get a quick coffee. And when we come back, I'd love to hear your views on what we've just commented, and maybe we can also have a bit of a discussion before we continue with the rest of the slides, of course. Maybe we can have a bit of a discussion on how you see your different industries going in the light of everything we have discussed. Is that okay for you?
Okay, thank you, Laura. Yes, I invite all the participants to reflect on your presentation, your interesting presentation, and propose element to be discussed further together. Also consider their own experience. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, and every scenario, the business scenario, is going to have their own unique realities, right? So, applying it to that business scenario is going to also bring all of this more contextual, I would say.
Yes, maybe to facilitate if there is someone that want to share their experience with the sustainability certification, even though it's a different context or different field of application, may be interesting as well to compare with those happening in the tourism context.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Your presentation is really interesting. I was thinking about your presentation that emphasizes sustainability awareness as both an organizational capability from one end, and from the other end as an employee awareness. So as sustainability is triggered by both the employee participation in sustainability practices, along with more an organizational perspective with climate, organizational climate, and so on.
Yeah.
Okay. If there are any questions, you can write in the chat, and time by time we can answer, or they can raise their hand.
Yes, we can do that as well. We can do that as well. So if there are nothing, so I'm going to jump in back into the presentation, all right? Right. So we now look a bit at climate risks and opportunities, and what you see here is almost climate change through a dual lens, right? So it's not just an environmental issue, but it's also a strategic and a financial one. And the core message here is that climate factors increasingly influence business performance through both the downsides of risks, but also the upsides of opportunity. And that effective management, therefore, requires them to integrate consistently within a strategic planning process. So we start with the left side, where we have transition risks from a shift towards a low carbon policy, policy and legal risks, which will be affecting inevitably carbon pricing, emissions regulations, disclosure requirements for companies. And these will, whether we like it or not, affect the cost structures for organizations, and also will affect their operational flexibility. So we are seeing technology risks stem more from rapid innovation, right? And this is rendering some assets and processes less competitive. I mean, we have to admit that. So the market risks are relating more to changing customer preferences and changing demand patterns, whilst reputation risks are reflecting more the stakeholder expectations and the potential impact of perceived inaction. Now, physical risks, we present a different and equally important, but a very different dimension. Because here we're looking at risks due to weather conditions like storms, like floods, like heat waves. And these can disrupt operations, they can disrupt supply chains. So then we have the more chronic risks. So these are the rising temperatures, which are also changing behavior, people's behavior, which inevitably then affect the buying, for example, right? And also the asset values are being affected by these chronic risks, and also the long-term planning, both of the business, but also of the consumer. So together, these risks are really highlighting that climate change affects both the short-term operation and the longer-term strategic positioning, I would say. Moving then to the right-hand side, we have here the opportunities. So we've got resource efficiency, which can reduce costs and improve our profit margins. We've got shifts in energy sources, which can create opportunities in renewable energy, for example. And yes, okay. And also we've got companies that are able to develop new products to target this new consumer trend. And enter therefore emerging markets with these new products and services. So from this side of the table, the perspective is that climate action is not just about mitigation, but is about capturing growth opportunities. And to be fair, we have also seen a transition in policy directives. going way back when we first started to discuss climate change, I remember being in some of those EU working parties. At the time, I was one of the national contact points for Malta, so I used to attend some of these working parties. I remember some of the discussions that were held at the time were more about a push for change from with a punitive direction. There was very little consideration of growth opportunities. It was more about regulation, right? Over time, we have seen those discussions shift to how can we capitalize on the climate wave. So we are seeing this shift not just in industry, but also in the thinking behind the interest in climate change, and obviously by repercussion, sustainability. Now, at the center of this diagram, we have the role of strategic planning and risk management. Now, this is where organizations are going to translate those climate risks and opportunities into very concrete actions, like, for example, capital allocation, like investment prioritization and operation adjustments. So integrating these climate considerations into strategy will then ensure that that the company's responses are both proactive, but also tailored to the current demand. Because one thing that we have definitely seen is a very volatile fluctuation. The other layer then shows how these factors ultimately translate. Thank you, Greta. The other layer then is how these actually translate into revenues, costs, asset values, essentially financial conditions of the business, right? So the linkage here is increasingly important, I would say. Investors and regulators are expecting companies to demonstrate this linkage. So things like on the income statement, we can include changes in revenues due to shifting demands, increased operational costs, potentially from regulation or from resource pricing. But on the cash flow statement and capital expenditures, we can look at low carbon investments and their return on investment. So we are expecting more and so to see a balance as we move forward. And I think companies that are systematically integrating climate risks and opportunities simultaneously in their operations, they're becoming in a better position to manage, one, the initial investment flow that needs to go in, but two, the long-term sustainability of their sustainability plan, and by default, the certification and anything related to that. All right, so what we've definitely established in the previous slide is that for sustainability to be sustainable, we need to change our business model. We need to change how we do business, right? In many areas of business, we have constraints which can come in the form of emission targets. Often they come in the form of resource limitations. I mean, for example, one of the major discussions which is happening right now is lithium. Because yes, we've got to shift towards electric vehicles, but we knew from the beginning that lithium is what it is. It's a resource which is finite. So lots of discussions going on there with regards to what will come next. And these types of discussions bring new value propositions. So we've seen a lot of innovation then happening in product designs, where companies are increasingly developing products with lower environmental footprints, incorporating recycled materials, improving efficiency, but most importantly, working to improve the product life cycle. And this is what started to differentiate the current offerings. Another business model which is getting a lot of momentum is circular models. So product as a service rather than like leasing and take-back programs, which enable a company to capture the value throughout the product life cycle and reduces resource consumption. So these models are also strengthening the business customer relationship and keeps indirectly also serves for customer loyalty. Investments in low carbon technologies and digital monitoring systems in advanced materials will also create capabilities that competitors may find difficult to replicate. So obviously early adoption can generate a first mover advantage that persists over time. And plenty of research in the field of marketing shows us that first movers get a significant advantage, not just in the immediate, but mostly actually in the longer term. All right. Let me just. So, once we speak of this, we have to speak a bit about brand trust. And brand trust, and I think more importantly, market credibility. Now, environmental performance and getting a certificate will enhance our brand reputation. It will signal that we are being transparent, that we have a long-term orientation, and that we give this value. So, in industries where the environmental issues are salient, where stakeholders often interpret strong performance, we are seeing evidence of good governance and strategic foresight as being very, very important. And I would say that this perception can really strengthen our customer loyalty and reduce reputation risk. So from this perspective, then trust becomes particularly important in the competitive markets. We have products or services. We will need to differentiate brands and influence purchasing decisions. And this differentiation can translate into increased customer retention and stronger brand equity. So this is not something which will happen overnight. This is something which will require time, but as time goes by, it should be it should yield a higher return on investment for the organization. So reputation starts to pay off. Now, another key factor here is transparency, right? Transparency is important in building the credibility, essentially. So once we have constructive engagement with regulators, with investors, with society, I would say in general, this transparency can be taken to a different level, right? So from an environmentally consultant perspective, we do encourage transparency and communication, specifically because we have ample examples where this does lead into more, well, it creates a loyalty base. People feel connected. So it enhances reputation and it goes beyond the superficial level of you selling. Please let me know if this point is not clear, because we're speaking about multiple dimensions of the consumer relationship here. Definitely, ultimately, brand trust is an intangible asset, but a very valuable asset that needs to be given serious consideration. And I think that consistency is what's going to reinforce this. And this is mainly why last time I was stressing, yes, it's possible to get certification in 4 months and 6 months, some of them in 1 year. But most organizations, in many cases, you don't want to do that, because that requires an accelerated and very focused attention. And when you stop that attention, then you're going to be scaling back, and the customer will get the hang of that. So you want to establish a situation where you can retain a consistency, right, throughout. Now, environmental sustainability shapes how companies are positioned within supply chains and broader industry ecosystems. So organizations will set emission targets. Very often they are not the ones setting them, but these are emission targets which are actually set by the regulations and directives, and also the compliance requirements for the licensing. And these expectations very often also extend to suppliers because of the goods coming in, the raw goods, and also to partners in business. So the value chain from this perspective gets a ripple effect. Now, we've established already that those with a high sustainable performance are more likely to be selected as preferred suppliers. And this preferential positioning then will lead to potentially longer-term contracts, deeper partnerships, and an increased collaboration on innovation and efficiency effectiveness. Now, collaboration across these supply chains is also becoming very common. Companies are recognizing more and more often that sustainability is not necessarily a business process that needs to be done in isolation. So a lot of effort can be done upstream or downstream, and a lot of joint initiatives can happen to reduce emission, improve logistics efficiency, develop sustainable material. And these, in essence, reduce the investment costs for organizations, but it also strengthens business relations, and they create a sense of shared value. So this is very important from, I would say, from a business perspective. This becomes extremely important. And ecosystem positioning, this is what this refers to, will also affect then the competitive dynamics. So firms that lead on sustainability will be able to influence the industry standards, and you will be able to shape expectations for performance and transparency. And this leadership style can then enhance their reputation and also create barriers for entry for other competitors. So they would essentially be shaping who can and who cannot influence the market. This is another way of, in a way, using sustainability to one's own advantage from an organization perspective. So taking this into account and going back to the first movers and the laggard situation we spoke of earlier, strong performance will gain greater strategic importance. Laggards will risk marginalization as expectations continue to rise. Are there any questions, please? I would like to ask whether there are any data supporting the idea that maintaining a certification is more challenging than obtaining it. All right. Well, yes and no is going to be my answer, and I will explain, Tiziana. First of all, when it comes to obtaining a certification, how difficult this is going to be is going to depend on the starting point of the organization, right? So let me see, my camera switched off. Am I seeing well? Yes. Sorry about that. So to obtain it, the difficulty is going to start from where you are actually departing, right? But if you ask me, are there any direct comparative studies? To my knowledge, these are very scarce. So I have not come across a comparative study across industry which shows us, whether it's possible, or whether maintaining certification for some industries is harder than so for others. Well, we have research that environmental experiences show back and forth between drivers and hindrances. So there are articles like this which show that there is some back and forth and some hindrances. There are also some studies that show that time, like cost of rectification and diminishing of perceived benefits, which are common reasons why organizations fail to maintain certification and burdens. And there's also, for example, in some research where which indicates that maintaining rating over time can be seen as difficult, but often this is also because the priorities of organization changes. So to answer your question, there's no research which gives us a conclusive answer to that direct link. There is research which shows us that it's not necessarily it's a bit hard to maintain for various reasons than it is to obtain. Okay, I think that's the general understanding. There are other articles, but I did not find the full text, because there's also some articles on ISO which come into that. So we look now at the sustainable. Right, so let's look a bit now at regulatory preparedness and how it becomes a competitive advantage. So what we do know is that being proactive can translate directly into moving regulatory change from being one as a constraint to being a source of competitive advantage. And therefore, companies that anticipate future standards and align their operations with those future standards, first of all, get the added advantage of having increased time to comply. But secondly, when those standards come out, you're going to have a number of organizations which are struggling to maintain them or fulfill the requirements. So what you get here is an opportunity to really be an opportunity to really have a first move experience, to really establish yourself in a new market. When you're establishing yourself, you're going to have less compliance costs. You're going to have fewer disruptions. So in the long run, even the setup in itself is going to cost you less. Now, regulatory preparedness will also enable faster market entry. So when your competitors are still trying to find a way to comply, you would have already run with it. And therefore, your product approvals, your operation licensing, this is all going to come beforehand. And bear in mind that companies that meet or exceed some requirements can also move more quickly than their competitors. And this speed translates directly to money. So this becomes extremely important. In some cases, leading companies will also actively participate in policy discussions, in industry initiatives, and they will also help to shape the regulatory environments as well. Now, by contributing in this way and by demonstrating some feasible solutions that they would have themselves had the time to come up with, they were also able to influence the direction of policy, the direction of standards. So you see how this can all have almost a two-way benefit. You can influence the standards that you yourself have to follow. Now, forward-looking compliance will also enhance credibility with regulators and stakeholders, and companies perceived as constructive and responsible would benefit from more collaborative relationships with authorities, which obviously then also facilitate approvals and, in the long run, reduce friction. So, to conclude this slide, I would really say that regulatory preparedness will give you an environmental strategy that is both flexible, reduces uncertainty, but also increases your return on investment on sustainability. So in this way, you won't be reacting to the change, but you will be leading the change. And that is where you want to be with sustainability. That's what's going to make it profitable as well for you in the long term. Now, unfortunately, sustainability does not always translate into advantage. It's not as simple as we may sometimes promote it. Because in order to do so, organizations need to also ensure that their operations are not operating independently, and I will explain what I mean by this. Many organizations have initiatives which are operating independently from the core strategy or from or that do not lack measurable outcomes. And when they don't lack these measurable outcomes, they fail to generate meaningful value. Now, when you have sustainability, your sustainable objectives and your business priorities need to, in some way, generate meaningful value, because this is what's going to translate them into income for your business. So fragmentation is a very common pitfall here. With companies pursuing multiple initiatives, but no real coherent framework, right? Or no clear performance metrics. And obviously this becomes a problem. Without integration into the decision-making, you're going to have efforts which are going to deliver very limited impact and by default then not deliver return on investment. So this is when the cost of sustainability does not justify the output for the company. I'm not talking about the environment here. Remember, at the end of the day, the company is doing this because there is a business reason for it, right, as well. Now, there are credibility caps, which can also be undermined here. Because when environmental claims exceed actual performance, and we have seen a number of instances, unfortunately, which ended in the news where this happened, Stakeholders may perceive greenwashing, leading to reputational damage and also loss of trust. And this is why I again always advocate for move slow at the pace of the organization. So in a transparency-driven environment, there will be consistency between messages and measurable outcomes. If you are not able to be transparent for any reason or other within the organization, then my advice would be to not be semi-transparent, but none at all, because then you cannot be contradicting yourself as an organization. Financial returns can also be limited if investments are not linked to customer value or cost savings or risk reduction. And sustainability initiatives need to be evaluated using very rigorous business cases to ensure that they contribute to more long-term performance and don't remain symbolic. Right. So let's conclude this slide by saying that competitive advantage and coming from sustainability depends on the quality of the execution of the organization. If you approach sustainability as a united organization where all departments are working towards common goals, then the likelihood of success is going to be much bigger. Unfortunately, when we look at many organizations, we find a lot of fragmentation. Beyond sustainability, I work with a lot of organizations on either when there are mergers or when there are or when they're doing business process re-engineering, right? And very often, the amount of fragmentation that we find is almost a guaranteed link. We always manage to have very quick wins right in the beginning of the exercise, which, to be honest, shouldn't be the case, because that means that fragmentation was the lead cause of many of the losses that the organization was making. So it always amazes me in every project how much impact this has when it comes to sustainability and the benefit, the financial benefit that a company gets from being sustainable. This is huge. This is enormous. All right. So here we have a slide about strategic alignment. Now, at the top of the visual, you have the very famous word strategy. We all speak about strategy. We all mean hopefully the same thing on strategy, but a lot of people also use the word very much to almost everything. It's become a very colloquial term. We're talking here about strategy as the organization's intended direction, right? So what are the long-term goals for the organization? Is it the decarbonization pathways? Is it resource efficiency targets? Is it sustainable growth priorities? Strategy should set the direction, but then how is that strategy broken down to have the marketing, the human resources, the finance, and other departments and other stakeholders, both internal and external, all aligned together? Because this is where we experience a lot of fragmentation that we were talking about before. We often speak of the central gap. The central gap is the friction that occurs when we translate that strategy into the operations of the different people, right, of the different departments. And from this point of view, sustainability very often encounters problems with silos in decision-making, with competing priorities in the organization. And the worst one is lack of ownership. To be fair, lack of ownership is also a number one catalyst for many business processes failing. So environmental initiatives can be seen as conceptual at a leadership level, but not necessarily fully integrated in operation planning. And again, this is where a lot of the discrepancies come up between obtaining a certificate and maintaining it. So you have here the slide to show all this. Now, closing this gap is going to require building a shared understanding across the organization. This effectively translates to a culture fit. Employees need to have clarity on how sustainability connects to their roles and how success will be measured. We need to train, communicate, and have cross-functional collaborations. But more importantly, we need to initiate a whole culture change. Otherwise, it's a guaranteed failure in the longer term. So from a strategic perspective, organizations that can successfully align their strategy with their execution will obviously then be in a better position to realize the benefits of sustainability. Right, so some key insights on competitive advantage. I mean, we've spoken so much about this, but I wanted to draw the main points. I think the most overarching insight is that environmental sustainability can create durable competitive advantage, but only when it is embedded as a capability, rather than when it is implemented as isolated projects. Now, capability building will involve integrating the environmental considerations into the strategy level, the operation level, the governance level, and also the innovation processes of the organization. Now, advantages will emerge most clearly when environmental performances reinforce the core strengths. So, for example, when companies let's take a company with strong engineering capacity, which might lead efficiency improvements, and a strong brand, which might go for differentiation to position itself differently in the market. So aligning sustainability with what you already do in a way, rather than reinventing the wheel, but providing that alternative. In the long term, I think a key thing you need to take is that consistency is key. If you cannot be consistent in the longer term, I would say better do absolutely nothing, because that lack of consistency can do more damage than the introduction of something can do good. So, based on all of this, why do we even bother with certification? Well, primarily, certification addresses a fundamental challenge in markets, the difficulty of differentiating between what is said and what is actual. So the certificate gives us the proof, in a way, that the company is really being sustainable. So when that is not really done, the company is not just undermining the itself, but it's also then undermining the certification body and the others within the same industry. Let me see, because there seems to be a comment. No, okay. So financial metrics, for example, will tell us what we're doing as an organization, right? They will give us a picture of an organization. Certification gives us a rubber stamp. It gives us a rubber stamp to promote ourselves as a company, as hold on, let me just check what the consent say. Yes, yes, it is sampling based.
May I say something about, for example, some company certified do the marketing using the certificate and saying that because they are certified, their processes or their sustainable objects and processes, whatever, are, how may I say, in compliance or working perfectly in some way. But when the certification body does the audit, it's very specified, clearly specified that it's a process systematic, impartial, whatever, but based on sampling. So it means that they don't check 100%, in the business, because that can be. Maybe, what they do usually is year by year, they change some requirements, that they did not audit the previous year, if they are, professional as they are. But it's always sampling based,
Yes. Yes, it is. Unfortunately, that is the case. And I say unfortunately because sometimes for an organization, so the certification body does things which are sampling based. The public scrutiny, though, can be much harsher. And we have seen organizations spend millions to overcome negative, bad reputation. So I agree with you. I don't think that the sampling is that the checks are robust enough. Can they be more robust? Yes. But I think we are, as organizations, we cannot be held solely by the certification standards because we have a more important body, which is the general public, and social media has not helped with that at all. So I would never recommend to an organization to ignore that because the negative repercussions are huge. I mean, we've seen companies on the brink of failure because of that. Does this answer, Tiziana? Does this correlate with what you intend?
Yes, it is. When I hear or read about a company business posting the certification as a proof of, it's like giving the certification a meaning that is not how it's intended. It has to be intended and as I said before, is very clear in the document left by the certification body that the process is based on sampling, and it means that there can be still failures, but it's how can I say, not included, I don't want to say included, but we are aware of this, even the clients must be aware. So after, for example, achieving the certification, the client must understand that his work has to go on, It's not achieved and that's it, It's not a process that you achieve the certificate and then it's done, all right,
Absolutely. Look, I always say, but to be honest, I don't just say this for sustainability. I say this for any business process. If there is a single doubt in whether the organization can maintain it or not, let's develop an incremental plan rather than an instant implementation plan. Because with an incremental plan, you will still get there in the end, but your organization will not have the reputational and financial risks that come across with implementation. You can still promote your sustainability initiatives and bank on it, and promote alignment with certification standards, will not get the certification. So if there is any doubt, I would always recommend that roundabout way, trying to understand where the echo is coming from. All right, are there any other comments? All right, let me just share again.
Yes, I have another comment.
All right.
This is about the supply chain. So in some way, I think that even if the business is more exposed to the greenwashing risk due to the supply chain. So in some way, I think that when you decide to go for a certification, in some way, the company, the business is required more effort, because let's say, you lack to, I don't want to say select or monitor your supplier. It can be a weak point that you are exposed. I don't know if I'm clear with my English. It's more effort in some way. It's like your business now is more large because it is including also the activity, whatever of your suppliers,
Yes. Well, that's the thing with sustainability, that it is in that way. What usually happens is that in your supplier contracts, you would have specific clauses safeguarding against this, and against taking responsibility for any sustainable infringements made by the supplier. Operationally, though, it becomes a bit of a tricky situation. So it's not, you cannot look at this as in isolation. So let me give you a practical advantage. Up to a few years ago, we used to speak a lot about exclusive contracts. Now in business, it was if you would negotiate as much as possible exclusivity. For many reasons, a lot of organizations are moving away from this negotiation of exclusivity. And we're looking at preferential relationships instead. And the reason is that this allows us the flexibility of not becoming dependent on specific suppliers. Because let's say you are my supplier, Tiziana, for whatever reason, whatever item. Now, if I depend on you, when it comes to reputational damage, I cannot. I have to be very cautious about how I go with mitigation strategies. Even if I have clauses in my contracts which allow me to, distance myself from whatever it is that your organization would have done wrong. But if I don't depend on you, then I have my backups to go to. Then I can probably enforce those clauses in the contract. So in practice, it doesn't work that straightforward. We've seen organizations where they paid off reputation damage, which was not necessarily caused by them, but the financial damage of not doing that was greater than the financial cost of paying it off. But typically, when we have situations which are high risk in this way, from an accounting perspective, there would be particular buffers put in place, or reserves, or I call them cushionings, is the colloquial term that we use to explain business, put in place, whether through insurances, whether through company reserves, whether through percentage allocations from income made, that would be specifically looking at mitigating these types of risks. But yes, I mean, sustainability does bring with it this added headache. Yeah. I mean, okay, I'm presenting it here, and it's not that hard the way I'm presenting it, right? Operation-wise, though, we're navigating very uncharted waters still when it comes to sustainability and consequences, I would say.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm seeing, I would consider if I can ask for finance penalties. Yes, you can ask in the contract, but as I said, it depends on your position as an organization. Because under your termination clauses, so there's a bit of legalities that I would advise that you also consider. You don't just see the supplier contract in isolation. Right. So why does certification exist? Buyers, investors, regulators will often not be able to directly observe what you're doing, so certification gives you the rubber stamp. The framework also gives you a strategy on how you can implement all of this, and over time, they contribute towards the institutionalization of sustainability norms. So we can say, therefore, that certificates are a trust infrastructure. They provide a form of independent validation for your business, right? And this third-party verification can then increase confidence in your reports on performance, and that indirectly will lead to more people trusting your organization. Now, standards will also, and verifications will also reduce the risk of misleading claims, which reduces the risk of reputation damage. This trust infrastructure should enable transactions where environmental performance becomes a decision factor for whether the consumer makes use of your organization or not. But to be quite honest, certification should complement, not be leading, your internal governance and reporting systems. So if you find yourselves in a situation where you are changing what you do because you need to change it to get a certificate, then I would generally say re-question your entire business model, because this is a recipe for disaster in many organizations. It should be the other way around. You first strengthen your governance and your reporting structure internally, and then that certificate should be a rubber stamp for that. So this is something to really, really keep in mind. If you're going for a certificate, be prepared to invest for it long term. You know, this is not something you do just for a short while. Remember that the strength of a certificate is really dependent on reputation and rigor. So that reputation can be lost. I always say it takes a company a lifetime to build one. It takes 2 seconds to lose one in terms of reputation. So you really need to keep that in mind. Now, how does the market interpret these environmental certifications? Well, they can be seen as proof of compliance, but very often they're seen as a mark of larger organization beliefs. So, a certified environmental management system may signal that a company has structured processes for identifying risks, for monitoring performance, for driving continuous improvement. So this can also imply that the company is very that the company is well structured and it is resistant to potential negative business processes and risks. So for customers, certification can simplify that decision-making is done by pre-qualified indicators. This shows the seriousness of the company. And obviously it's more valuable in supply chains, in complex supply chains, where you are very resource intensive. So the meaning of certification is not uniform, right? Investors, for example, may interpret this as a low-risk organization. Now, in industries where certain standards are widely recognized, because we also have still this very big fluctuation between industries, they can carry significant weight, right? In others, where they are not yet widely recognized, they will carry less weight. For example, most certificates carry much more weight in the tourism sector, for example. So stakeholder familiarity, regulatory alignment, particular industry norms, they're going to have a deciding factor on how the market will interpret your certificate. And obviously understanding this will allow you to choose which is the best option for you, even the best certificate for you. All right, let's focus a bit now on our brand and our reputation in a bit more detail. I know we've spoken a lot about this. Now, when we look at reputation benefits coming out from our brand, we're looking at what do I get for investing in this certificate as an organization? That is the question we're going to ask. And the reputation value is often quantified in terms of increased transactions, right? So what is the amount, the increased transaction rate I'm expecting to see in my organization, and that would counteract the increased cost. But there is a problem with this, and that is the risk of over-reliance on certification without substantial performance improvements. And this is a real risk because a lot of organizations sometimes think that this certificate is the magic touch. Stakeholders are increasingly scrutinizing whether certifications reflect meaningful outcomes or simply process compliance. And companies, therefore, that pair those certificates with measurable performance improvements are going to be much more likely to reap and realize the reputational benefits. So certification can amplify brand trust, but they also do so by translating the underlying performance into accessible signals. So their effectiveness is linked to authenticity and to consistency within the organization's broader sustainability strategy. So the certificate on its own will do, but will not do enough to really see significant improvement. Sorry. Right, so the financial implications of all of this are indirect, but they can be very significant over time, influencing perceptions of risk, governance, quality, and operational discipline, I would say. Means that certifications can contribute to improved investor confidence and stakeholder trust, which will have a direct effect on your financial conditions and valuation, which can even multiply in some instances. Now, certification from this perspective will support revenue growth. It will give you access to new markets. It will give you access to new procurement processes. And this can translate into a stable revenue stream and a stronger customer relationship, which will also contribute to financial performance over the long term. So, investor perception will play a very critical role in this valuation process. And while certificate alone will rarely drive valuation changes, they can reinforce your narrative as an organization. And this would be a narrative built around strong governance and forward-looking strategy. Targets plus good performance data will really give a good overall assessment of your organization. All right. So limitations and market challenges. So despite their benefits, I would say that environmental certifications do face limitations. First of all, there are a growing number of standards and a growing number of schemes. This, I think, does create some confusion. There's also some overlap in some certificates. So it's very difficult sometimes for organizations to determine what carries most credibility and what works best for them. So we do have that issue. We also have a bit of an issue with comparability. Certificates vary in scope and rigor and methodology. So two companies with very different certification may, not be comparable, even though the certification is within the same area. And this does reduce clarity. It does reduce clarity mostly with the general public, who's the end consumer, and who ultimately needs to be most clear about these things. Stakeholder awareness will also vary significantly. So some certifications are widely recognized, whereas others are only known within the specific industry. And obviously, this creates some question marks. Another limitation is that some focus on processes rather than outcomes. So process-based certifications can improve management practices, but they may not necessarily reflect actual environmental changes and actual environmental performance. And this, people know what they see. So this will create some skepticism amongst stakeholders. Also, we don't yet have an overarching body for all certification, right? So that is another thing which is one has to be mindful of at this stage. Another thing to be mindful of is that in the early stages, certifications may differentiate companies, while in more mature market, they become a bit of a baseline expectation. So this will then underscore a continuous improvement and strategic alignment. So you do need to see as well your industry, your specific industry, where the certification requirement is. Let me just see, because I have comments. Sharing. So can you give an example of certification? Hold on, just a message. Can you give an example of certification or criteria rewarding processes over performance? I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you tell me exactly what you want from me?
Hello, I'll try to
Yes.
use my voice to explain better.
Yes, please.
From my understanding, you have just said that some certifications award processes.
Yes, over processes.
Yes, over environmental performances. Right? Did I understand right?
Yes.
So I wonder what this can mean concretely Could you give an example?
All right, now I understand. Okay, so for example, let's take the ISO standard, right? ISO standard 14001. That's the standard for the environment. This standard looks specifically at the process and systems that the organization has in place. So it looks at the planning, the monitoring, the continuous improvement levels. That's what it looks for, right? So a company can end up being certified even if its actual improvement and output is marginal. Because if the processes and the compliance systems are there according to the ISO standard, it's going to get the certification, right? So that's definitely the case. And then there's the lead, which could fall into this, but the lead is a bit more peripheral. So this looks at performance pathways, right? But much of its scoring is still about the inputs that the company makes. So again, if the company is ticking those boxes, irrelevant, the outputs are not really measured for certification. So if the company is still ticking those boxes, it will still pass and for recertification, for example. Up to some time ago, this was also the problem with most ECGs in the ECG rating. Sorry, not ECG, ESG ratings, because a lot of governments are rated on this, right? A lot of governments were focusing more on the initiatives that they do in terms of structures and policies and support for people to transition, rather than the actual verified reductions. So up until recently, at a European Union level now, not at a country level even, we only focused on projections. We did not focus on actual environmental impact reductions. This is just changing recently. I don't know if this answers your question.
Yes, thanks.
All right. I'm just going to share again. Right. So yes, so we do have some limitations there. Now, what does the evidence shows us? It shows us that when we have good environmental performance and we combine that with resilience, we tend to have longer term positive financial outcomes. So this is something which we have a causal relationship for. Environmental capability can be a stabilizing factor, especially in uncertain or operational environments, but it should not operate in isolation. So you need to have broader organization discipline for this to make sense. Right. So yes, something else I can say about this is there are some patterns observed across markets, that the benefits tend to accrue over longer time horizons, but short-term financial impacts can happen. They will be modest, but there is the cumulative effect factor. And because the initial savings are modest, this is one of the reasons why a lot of companies tend to lose interest. But it does reinforce the need to view sustainability through a longer term strategic lens. So you need to be an environmental leader, and to be an environmental leader, you need to have the governance structures that distinguish you from the rest. Environmental leaders often have clear accountability at the very senior levels. They are supported by board oversight, performance metrics are linked to incentives, and this alignment will then trickle down in the organization. Data plays a very critical role. Leading organizations based on data. The amount of data that companies generate is enormous. The amount of companies using the data that they are generating is ridiculous. It's almost insignificant, right? And we are in a day and age where data warehousing has become so simple to implement. So this in itself, beyond sustainability now, to be honest, this in itself is a worrying factor in many industries from a business point of view. We should be basing most of our decision makings on data and data processing. Data can enable better decision making. It can support us with setting targets. It can enhance transparency with shareholders. And business intelligence is really easier to implement now. We've got tools which make it so easy. Cultural alignment is also very important. Companies need to embed sustainability in their cultural values, and employees at all levels need to understand the relevance of environmental performance for the organization's success. Otherwise, you can have all of the certificates in the world, you're just risking a very bad reputational downfall. So at the end of it, honesty is what builds trust and reinforces perceptions. For executives, this means that sustainability has to be seen as a competitive factor. One needs to understand the intersects where performance intersects with value creation, sustainable performance intersects with value creation, and strategic prioritization needs to be done. It's essential because not all environmental initiatives are going to deliver equal impact. So especially if it's an organization with limited resources, you want to go for the most impact. Now, another implication is capability building. Environmental performance is dependent on data systems, cross-functional coordination, and specialized expertise. So you need to build your capacity in this. And you also need to look at how sustainability can, and I say this cautiously, be manipulated to influence your competitive positioning. If we face reality, every organization exists to make money, right? So every investment must somehow lead to that. Now, what we're discussing here is how can we make that happen and in the process contribute to the environment. I think that's where we need to go. And that is when it will start to make sense for many organizations. So, based on this, environmental sustainability requires leaders' attention because it's going to affect the long-term resilience and growth of the organization, and it can really capture new opportunities. So, from a practical perspective, I would say that organizations can start by identifying the factors that they can really influence. Initially, monitor these and see how they could be manipulated to improve operational improvements first, and then what certificates could align with that and could be used also to help you with the process. Yes, why not? And in our previous session, we did speak of bodies which actually help with this. So continuous monitoring becomes very, very important, and also maximizing both operational and reputation returns. Now, I'm aware of the time, but actually what we have left are 3 actual organizations. So just 3 case studies, right? So I won't spend too much time on each of them because I've got the case study always written here. But basically, the first one is from a Danish oil and natural gas organization, which undertook a very strategic transformation to divest most of its fossil fuels assets and focus on offshore wind and renewable energy. Now, obviously, this created a cost initially, but this repositioning did enable the company to secure longer-term contracts in multiple markets, and it provided stable revenue streams and it also reduced their exposure to fossil fuel price volatility, which in the end led to a very big change in investor perception on the company. I think this was one good positive experience. Company I'm sure many have heard about, Unilever. Well, there's still more to do, but they have invested for more than a decade now in initiatives like sustainable agriculture, deforestation reduction, and supply chain traceability. And they've done this to also counter their carbon footprint. And also there is I think this is a company which has really established a direct link between sustainability and its brand strategy, right? And I think this in itself, this makes it a very good case example. And the last company is Interface. Now, Interface does modular flooring, and since the 90s, this company has pursued an ambitious strategy to really reduce emissions, recycle its content, and advance circular manufacturing principles. And it has, in doing so, it has reshaped its entire operations and its market positioning. So I would say that by incorporating these bio-based materials and recycled products, it has done its best to improve product durability, reduced its carbon footprint, and created a new niche market for itself, right? And certification, transparent reporting has also, in the long run, increased the company's credibility. So with that, I end here with some key takeaways for you to consider and read through. I hope that overall you did find this interesting. I will stop sharing now. I hope that overall you did find this interesting. I do invite, I know our time is up, but I do invite anyone who has further questions or would like to, clarify anything. You should have a copy of the presentation, but if anything requires further clarification, please do reach out to me. I'll be very happy to answer any questions I receive. I believe you will have my email address, so you can reach out to me there, or you can reach out to me through Armando, and he will definitely pass on your emails. So thank you so much for being with me, yes, I wish you all the best of the remainder of the afternoon.